Hi guys, we're here for another GAMSAT podcast. Today the topic of discussion is going to be ESL students and how they should best prepare for the GAMSAT and what are some of the myths around that and the best ways to approach it if you're coming from that background. The guest for today's podcast is Qing. I'll let her introduce herself. Qing, what do you do in life and here at Fraser's as well?
So I'm Qing. I'm currently a first-year medical student at Melbourne University. And yeah, that's pretty much all I do, studying med.
Sweet. So sounds like sounds interesting. I'm sure you have a lot more to your personality, just not letting it out over here. And obviously, you work at Fraser's. What exactly do you do at Fraser's, and what are some of the different stuff that you're involved with? Maybe just like a couple of things.
So currently, I'm just a Section 3 tutor. Being involved in the chemistry and biology team mainly. And then I recently got involved with the Medic Guild team, but I haven't really, personally written anything yet, but sort of just been in the background, seeing how things work. And then hopefully in the future, I might get to write some of my own pieces.
Sweet. That's awesome. Cool. So without delaying too much, we'll get straight into the meat of the session. So obviously one of the main reasons we brought you on is because you are an ESL student. English is your second language. Do you want to maybe tell me a little bit about your history, like with English as the language? At what point did you start picking it, start learning it? Was it from childhood, Mandarin was just your primary language, or did you start learning it later on in life? Maybe just a little bit of background on that.
So I grew up in Malaysia, so it's like a multicultural country, but then
Sweet.
Mandarin is still my primary, first language.
Nice.
And it wasn't until I came to Australia about 10 years ago,
Yeah.
when I was in primary year 5, then that was when I started really picking up English properly.
Nice.
And then from then on, it was just trying to use English every single day so that I can improve on that. Yeah.
Sweet. Yeah. Love Malaysia. I get around the rendang every now and then. Sweet. Cool. That's good to hear. So let's jump straight into it. And obviously we have a lot of students who were coming from a second language background, and for them, the GAMSAT, especially section 1 and 2, is quite a daunting phenomenon, right? I've had quite a few students that I've met who've done actually really, really well in section 3, but then on the other hand, they've done really poorly in section 1 and 2. And again, for a lot of them, the idea is that the primary barrier is English, right? So hopefully today we can discuss what are some of the myths around that, and again, how we can actually go about thinking about how we can reorient the way that we study for section 1 and 2 as people from second language backgrounds, such that it's as effective as possible, right? To a certain extent, it is a slight disadvantage. If English is your first language, there is that element where it just makes things a little bit easier, but it's not a huge disadvantage to the point that you can't get the mark that you want to get, right? So maybe we'll start off with maybe just some general advice. What are your initial thoughts on how you felt about it and how you approached language in the GAMSAT as a whole?
I think for the past few times, so I said it 3 times.
Yeah.
And the first 2 times when I sat it, I felt like I was at a disadvantage because I'm an ESL student. But then since my last time, I feel like I need to give myself a bit of confidence. And I thought maybe a change of mindset is really needed. And so I think thinking that you're not at a disadvantage because of your English language, and really just trying to put yourself out there and trying to grasp the language itself, and then trying to use that to your advantage, as well as your cultural background to your advantage. So just having that mindset that you are not behind because of your language really just puts you there in the first place.
Yeah, sweet. No, that's great to hear, right? A really big part of the barrier, I think, especially with section 2, is the mindset that a lot of second language English students have. And that's that, okay, because English is my second language, I'm going to do bad in this section, therefore I'm just not going to give a damn about it, let me just do bad, right? Whereas, like you're saying right now, you kind of shifted that mindset from your second to your third sit, and if I remember correctly, that's when you did the phrases package and kind of worked in shifting that mindset. And obviously with section 2, almost coming from a different background is almost an advantage to a certain extent, because you come in with all these different ways of thinking about things that adds a really good level of depth and analysis to your essays. So I think that's a pretty pertinent point, the idea of shifting your mindset. So that's kind of the first point in terms of like shifting mindset at the broader level. Another thing that I kind of have seen tutoring a few second language English students myself is in terms of mindset in the way that they learn, I kind of like to talk about this idea of conscious learning versus subconscious learning. And that's kind of like where a lot of second language English students, they're just like, okay, if I read more, I'll get better at English. It'll just naturally happen. Whereas I try to get them to think about doing it in a more conscious fashion. Is that something that you did throughout your learning? Maybe how exactly did you think about that process as a whole?
I think the same way. So I've always been told like maybe talking to people with a native English background would be a good way to practice your English and learning new words and things like that. However, I find that if I'm not consciously picking up on those new words and trying to actually actively learn those and actively, write those sentences down when I read a good sentence in a book, or trying to remodel them, change a few words and actually trying to, put them in my context, then I don't really learn it. And it sort of just goes in one ear and comes out the other sort of thing. And so I think just trying to be very conscious and very active in your learning when it comes to picking up the English language is very important.
Yeah, that's awesome. Like, completely agree, right? It's that conscious application of your learning process. I think like even some of my students, I just tell them like, if you see a really good sentence in something that you're reading, feel free to take that sentence, add it to a bank of sentences that you have, and then reuse the wording of that sentence in later essays, right? Instead of just like reading the piece and being like, I get it, and then like at some point you might try to emulate that piece, but it just doesn't sound anything like it, and it's confused, so on and so forth. It's picking up those ways of talking about things in a very conscious fashion, whether it be structure, language, or your ideas. And even when we come to section 1, the conscious application is something that's really important. So you harbored on another point where you got to it, and I kind of want you to break it down a bit more. But that's kind of the point of learning with others, learning through your peers, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
How is that a part of your experience, just like being part of the Phrases cohort as a whole? How did that help you develop your language, having a process of feedback?
So I think before the Phrases community, before I joined that, I was preparing GAMSAT by myself at home, and so it felt like I wasn't very motivated because I was doing it myself, and the whole like I'm at a disadvantage with section 1 and 2, and so I'm just going to focus on section 3. And in terms of like after joining the Phrases community and the cohort, I think just being able to talk to other people about how they're going, how they're tackling their own problems, and then also sharing each other's strengths and weaknesses, that I think that really just helps me out. And I think I made really good friends. For example, Kelly, we're both EAL students.
That's cute.
Yeah.
I've seen Qing and Kelly. They're besties. It's cute.
Yeah, and I think it was through Phrases that we sort of met, and then we're both EAL students. We really sort of understand where we stand and in our own struggles, and I think therefore we just really try to help each other out. Yeah. And instead of tackling the GAMSAT by yourself, it just feels more like a team, and I think that really just push you. What makes you want to work harder.
No, that's awesome, right? And I think like another thing that I'll kind of add to that as well is a lot of students, like when you're developing the people that you study with, or when you're thinking about who are the people that you study with, a lot of students that try to tend to stick with the people that are just like the exact same in terms of their skill set as them. But it's important to have like some sort of diversity, again, to, like as you mentioned, share those weaknesses and strengths, right? Like you might have strength in a particular thing and you can help your friends out with that, and then the things that you're weaker in, they can help you out with that, and then that's how you just build and grow overall. So I think that's a pretty good summary of like 3 of the major core ways of thinking about the GAMSAT at a general level, how to approach it if you're an ESL student, right? That's just consciously learning, changing of the mindset, and having peers a process of feedback.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll get into the specifics now of the two different sections, starting off with obviously the notorious section 1 that everyone, whether they're second language or first language, seems to hate, and rightly so to a certain extent. What were some of the ways you tackled section 1, and what were some of the difficulties you thought you faced as an ESL student in section 1? And if you don't mind me asking, what was the level of improvement you saw across your different sits of section 1?
Okay, so in terms of section 1, so I went from below 50.
What?
Below 60. So I think it was 58 or something to a 69.
That's really impressive. An 11-point jump in section 1 is kind of like a 25-point jump in section 2.
Yeah.
Very impressive.
So in terms of that, I think the most important thing that I learned, let's start with what I struggled with. And the first thing that I struggled with was actually trying to read really fast and trying to really understand the passage, and then answer the question after that. So the time pressure was what I struggled with. And then coupled with that, also trying to figure out how to answer the question as best as I can without really just, answer it because I feel like it. And so after joining the phrases cohort, I think what I learned was that it's important to learn the skills, such as like critical thinking skills and logical reasoning skills in order to answer the question. So it's not so much like trying to, expand my vocabulary, trying to just read faster without any like intention and things like that. So I think learning the skills like annotating, when you're reading fast, just, remember the main points and then go from there. So I think in terms of how I improve in section 1, just really focus on building and honing the skills needed to complete section 1.
Yeah, that's awesome, right? And I think there is a level that English is needed to a certain extent for section 1, right? But it's not that section 1 is testing English, right? It's testing those skills that you talked about. And if you can think about developing those skills, you can kind of undo the barrier that you have in terms of your English ability by using those skills, right? And focusing on that. And those skills, they're not relevant only to people who speak English. Everybody can develop those skills. Sometimes you might have those skills at a really high level in your first language, right? So it's now thinking about how can you actually bring them into the way that you're reading English, right?
Yeah.
And sounds like you did that really well. That's awesome to hear. So again, I think with section 1, one of the primary ways of thinking about it's not an English exam. It's a humanities psychometric exam, right?
Yeah.
And English is just obviously the language that it's being tested in, right? And then now when you think about it like that, you can develop those skills, and then from there you can see that huge improvement. So another thing that I think we can kind of maybe talk about as well is, we mentioned it earlier, the idea of conscious learning in the GAMSAT as a whole. In terms of section 1, what were the ways that you tried to consciously learn? I used air quotation marks, but most people don't see that on a podcast, obviously. So consciously learn in quotation marks.
I think because my vocabulary is quite limited, as I think it is, I think when I'm trying to do section 1, I really took on the approach of writing the vocabulary down that I don't understand or don't know, and I would write it and give it. So I would write the definition of the word, and as well as the context that the word is used in. So then the next time that I see this word, okay, I know that it's in sort of like a medical ethics context. Or maybe it's just sort of like a poetry context, and so maybe it's not that important to me. Or maybe words that appear in options, so in section 1 options, such as tone words. And I know that tone words are very important because they make up quite a few questions. And so I would try to learn and really understand, and also try to use those words in my everyday life. But I'll be very selective in which kind of vocabulary I use. So which kind of vocabulary that I actually learn. So, those important words I would actually try to learn, such as tone, such as words that appear quite often after doing my logging. But other words like that appear in poetry and I don't think they're very important to me, I would kind of just scrap that and move on. Yeah.
That's important, right? I think just the point that you touched on over there, not just for section 1, but for the GAMSAT as a whole, knowing what to prioritize and when to prioritize it, right? It's like learning every single word ever, like having a dictionary of the day, not a very big fan of that. But being able to kind of like identify that these words are very important because they're words that pop up in the answer and they test tone. Therefore, I need to make sure I take those words, note them down, and bring them later on, when they come up in the questions, knowing how to tackle them, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So that's awesome to hear, right? That was a clear, direct way that you kind of consciously learned for section 1, and that's something again that we definitely want to be doing for section 1, for section 2, and honestly even for section 3 for those people who are not even English as a second language. There's kind of just like universal advice for everyone, right? I'd just say it's more pertinent to those particular students. So another thing that I've kind of picked up, and I think you alluded to it while you were talking just now, is you mentioned medical ethics, right? And something that we see is that, again, with section 1, there's kind of trends of different types of stems that they bring, different types of information. Like, medical ethics, politics is quite popular, like philosophical stuff as well. So it's kind of like this point that you don't really have to become good at all of English, right? You just have to become good at particular types of particular ways that English is used, right? And I think that's one piece of advice that I've found is really helpful for students, is that, okay, don't go out there and learn English, right? Because like, if I tell you go home and learn English, it's like, where the hell do I start, right? But if I tell you go home and learn the way that people talk about economic systems, right? You'd go read a Wikipedia page in capitalism, you'd read a couple of other Wikipedia pages, a few articles here and there, and then the next time it comes up in a passage, you're a lot more in a question, in a STEM, you're a lot more comfortable with it, right? Same with like if it's something from like a medical ethics STEM, right? You kind of familiarize yourself with that area of language, right? So again, that's not like bulletproof, because on the day they can bring 1 or 2 stems that are not within those areas of language, but it recognizes the trends and it gives you a direction of studying English rather than just, Qing, go home and get better at English. It's like, okay, thanks, bro. It's like great advice, right?
Yeah.
So was that something that you did in terms of the way that you prepared?
Yeah, I think I definitely did. So Fraser's taught me to break different pieces down into like different categories. Say, let's say technical texts or even like literary prose. And so I think I took it very literally. So I broke it down into, okay, I'm going to study technical text today, and these are the skills that I need for technical text. So for example, I need to be able to see the main points and be able to underline them when I answer them, so that in the exam I'm not just simply guessing or simply just recalling. I'm able to actually find them and pinpoint them in the text. So for example, the next piece will be literary prose. The skills that I'm practicing, it would be like being very empathetic and trying to actually enjoy the piece and put myself in the shoes of the hero or the character, so that I'm actually like understanding the piece really well. And then so I think from there, trying to really differentiate the pieces and the text really allow me to sort of use different skills and apply them to different kinds of pieces.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, right? So I think that's a pretty good summary on 3 really good pieces of advice for section 1, like going back to, again, the conscious learning and how we apply that in section 1, then the different like areas of language that you can focus on, and then obviously I think the most important is that section 1 is testing particular skills, right? And even you don't have to be amazing at English, you just have to have like a certain base level, and then from there, if you develop those skills, you can see like a pretty huge increase like yourself, right? So let's move on to section 2, right? A bit more interesting as always. How did you go across your different sits in section 2? If I remember correctly, you pretty much smashed your last one out, but do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about how you went and what were some of your general thoughts on that?
So I think in terms of section 2, I've always been No, I like writing. And so I wouldn't say it's my strength, but I do enjoy it. And I scored about 70 in my first round.
Nice.
But then my last round, I scored to about an 80, 81 or 2.
No, that's very impressive.
Yeah, my third sitting. And I think from what I have realized after like looking back at it retrospectively, it's just not so much trying to be really fancy in my writing, trying to use very big vocabulary and be very pretentious, but just being really honest in your writing and trying to analyze, trying to be very in depth with your analysis and try to have more complex ideas. And I think that was one thing that I took away when I did section 2 with the phrases cohort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice, sweet. So it's like, you mentioned depth of analysis. And again, like the way that we teach section 2 over here is for those of you who probably have like looked at a bit of our resources and free resources online, you'd have seen that we have that model called the ideas-based approach, where again, we look at these broader in-depth ideas that allow students to take their level of analysis to that next level, right? And a lot of times, like second language students, when they first see this, they're like, oh, this is crazy. I'm definitely not going to be able to do this. I should just stick to writing about simple stuff, right? And actually what I tell them is, no, this is the opposite. This actually makes it easier for you as a second language student. And for me, there's 2 main reasons, right? The first reason is that as a second language English student, even for those people who've just like learned English in like the last 2 or 3 years, it's not like you don't have ideas. Probably if we were to speak in your native language, you'd have more interesting ideas than most of us, right? It's more so the being able to express those ideas in English, right? And now that's why the ideas-based approach helps. It's because we're not telling you over here, learn how to talk about everything.
Yeah.
We're telling you, okay, what are the particular ideas that you're going to use in your essay? Learn those really well, right? So in the same way that we talked about section 1, it's giving you direction, right? Like you mentioned that a lot of your essays, you talked through the lens of economics, right? And you became really strong at that, such that you knew how to talk about economics. And if someone read your essay, they wouldn't think that this is someone who's a second language English student. They probably think like this is someone at like doing like a master's in like a political economy or something, because you learned that language, like that area of language so well. Whereas if I'd given you a different theme and I said like write this through like a moral philosophical lens, you'll be like, mate, like
I wouldn't know how to.
Like you wouldn't know how to, right? And that's fine, right? We don't know how to do. We don't need to know how to do everything for the GAMSAT. We just need to know how to do the things that we want to do, especially for section 2, since it allows us the more creativity in what we're going to put out. Whereas compared to section 1 and 3, you have to respond directly and choose the correct answer, right? So yeah, anyway, went on a little bit of a rant over there, but like that's good to hear. The other thing though is that I'll kind of mention in terms of this is now when we start to think about second language English students having good ideas, the difficulty that I've seen with a lot of them is, again, not the development of the idea, but the expression of the idea. So how did you feel in terms of developing the way you express these ideas?
So like you said before, I had a notebook that I keep that have like really good phrases when I was reading articles online about so I wrote about like capitalism, so I would have lots of good phrases and especially vocabulary as well, and I tried not to find vocabulary that is like huge and like make it like a jargon. So I would try to use those vocabulary and try to find substitute that I would write in my own words. And then when it comes to writing my essay, I would try to recall those phrases and try to remodel them into my essay. And I think that just really helped me to be more fluent in what I'm trying to express, because sometimes if I use my own language, maybe it wouldn't really be interpreted the same way. And so having those like phrases booklet really just allows me to sort of say what I want to say, but also be understood by someone else.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, right? And it goes back to that point that we mentioned initially, conscious learning, right? Instead of just reading an article and be like, oh, I'll use that in my essay at some point, you directly picked out the elements of it that you thought were useful. You wrote that in your notebook and you were like, okay, at a certain point, I'm going to reuse these in my essay. So, and that makes perfect sense. It's that process of conscious learning application. Sweet. Yeah, awesome. Any final thoughts on section 2 from your perspective, or just the GAMSAT as a whole from the experience as a second language student?
I think section 2 may be quite daunting for a lot of people, but in terms of like how to go about it at the very start, I think just start writing. There's no better way to improve than to just start writing and giving other people your piece, and having them to look at your piece, and then just having some feedback will be really great. And then just being really patient with your progress and your learning is very important as well, because sometimes after 3 weeks you might not see any improvement and you might be really frustrated and want to give up. But I think just keep at it, just being very, very motivated, and having friends helping you will be a great way to just be very motivated. And then just being patient, and I think once you sort of like be very diligent in your own work, sort of keep progress and keep check, then I think you'll reach there one day.
Yeah, that's awesome, right? And like definitely, even like yourself, one thing I'll say actually before I get to that is, I feel like all of the stuff that we've mentioned today, we've been talking about it through the lens of being a student who's a second language student. But I feel like all of this advice is useful for just like anybody who's sitting the GAMSAT, right? It's like it's more pertinent to those particular people. But all of the stuff that we'd mentioned, any GAMSAT student, even if you did literature in year 12, you have a really good level of English, all of this stuff will still be really helpful for you sitting this exam, right? So that's like one of the first things that I want to mention. And like, yeah, again, like you did really well. You can see that improvement. You can have that process of thinking about it. And whether someone's a second language student or a first language student with marks like yours, they'd definitely be proud, right? So again, I think bring back to a lot of the stuff that we said, it's not being daunted by it and reframing your mindset, and then taking those individual nuggets that we mentioned of advice and trying to fit that into the way that you learn.
Yeah.
Awesome. Sweet. So I think we'll end on that notice. Thanks everyone at home for tuning in. I usually say dialing in, which doesn't make any sense, but yeah, thanks everyone at home for tuning in, and hope to see you guys all on the next podcast.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.